You ever have one of those mornings where the world feels normal for 30 seconds, and then somebody goes out of their way to prove you were wrong? That was my Tuesday, walking out to my truck with a coffee in one hand and the kind of small, boring plans that make life livable, and then finding the passenger door swung wide like somebody had invited trouble in for breakfast. Papers everywhere, a toolbox overturned, and the one thing I never expected to lose: my sense that my little patch of the world was still mine. My name is Nate Hollis, and I live on a street where everyone knows the brand of your mower and whose kid borrows whose ladder. It's not a gated neighborhood. It's not a scandal magazine, just a collection of houses and a homeowners association that likes to keep score. The HOA around here is run by people who treat bylaws like gospel and gossip like scripture, and the president a mess. Lorraine Pike runs her little kingdom with a smile that could slice apples and a clipboard that never leaves her hand. She's the kind of person who calls meetings for lawn height violations and shows up at sunrise to measure hedges. We'd traded civil nods for years. I never pictured her orchestrating a raid on my truck. When I first saw the kid crouched in the front yard, I thought he was helping, bending to pick up my papers. Then I saw the way he looked at Mess Harp, guilty, like a cornered animal, and the smell of adrenaline filled the air. "He's ours," Lorraine said behind me, the words slick as oil. "Neighborhood watch. We caught him on the cul-de-sac last week." She had that helpful tone people use when they want to convince you they've done you a favor and robbed you at the same time. It's small things that make things bigger. I'm not a man who loses his temper every time a rule is bent. Me life's too short and my dog's too loyal, but there's a line between enforcement and theater, and Lorraine had turned enforcement into a public performance, with me as the unwitting prop. "You don't just take things from people's property," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "If you think someone stole something, you call the police." Lorraine smiled, that smile equal parts smug and sanctimonious. "We did what we had to do. The community has to protect itself." Her volunteers gathered like a small, determined jury. One of them held up a phone and said, "We've got video." Later I'd find out what that meant: a shaky clip from a Ring camera with timestamps and an attitude, but in that moment it felt like a cruel joke. My privacy weaponized against me by the very people who claimed to protect it. The kid's name was Marco, 17, jittery, more frightened than guilty in his eyes. He kept saying, "I didn't," and then shutting down, because adults can be loud enough to dissolve excuses. Lorraine leaned in, voice low but sharp. "You're not from here, kid. You don't obey rules. You take what you want." She made her accusation like she was explaining a math problem instead of human beings. Cold, neat, unsympathetic. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. There was a camera on my porch, me old nest, because my wife insisted we have it after a break-in scare last winter. I had footage. It was stupidly simple footage: a shadow, a hoodie, hands rummaging through the truck. I pulled my phone out and said, "Wait, let me show the police." Lorraine's face flicked between irritation and calculation. "We already handled it," she said. "We don't need," she never finished, because that's when Officer Ramirez arrived. Lights muted at first. Neighbors don't like an all-siren parade, and played the grown-up in the room. Watching him review the clip was like watching a slow-motion verdict unfold. Officer Ramirez squinted at the pixels, then at Marco, then at Lorraine. He asked calm questions. "Did anyone force entry? Who reported this?" Lorraine answered quickly, with the kind of certainty only rehearsed narratives can buy. She'd curated a story. The neighborhood was under siege, and she, the vigilant guardian, had saved the day. But the footage doesn't lie the way people do. It showed Marco's hands nervous, searching, yes, but it also showed him stuffing an old radio into a backpack. It showed him cursing under his breath when he realized the truck was empty of anything valuable. It didn't show him breaking a window or threatening anyone with a weapon, because he didn't. It showed a kid who'd made a dumb choice, and a community ready to turn that choice into a headline. The first act of my reaction was very unheroic. I wanted to throttle Lorraine with words. I wanted to explain the principle of property and due process, to point out that the HOA had no right to deputize itself and stage a seizure on private property. But then the second act took over, something colder, more effective. I asked Officer Ramirez to look at my camera, and when he did, he took the time to look closely, frame by frame, and then he asked to speak with Marco privately. They walked toward the cruiser, and I stood there with my coffee gone cold and the feeling of being examined by every neighbor. Marco, it turned out, had been taking small things from unlocked cars for months, junk radios, loose change, a set of old tools, and selling them to a friend 2 blocks over. He'd been on the edge for a while. His mother worked nights, bills stacked like unwanted postcards, which is not an excuse, but it's the kind of context that shapes decisions. Officer Ramirez treated him less like a headline and more like a kid who could go one of 2 ways: court or community program. He read Marco his rights in a voice that sounded like a surprise, because sometimes the law notices human things too late. Lorraine wasn't satisfied with that. She wanted public shame. She wanted resignation letters, stricter patrols, and HOA-led tribunal, things that sound important when read aloud at a meeting with coffee and muffins. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen again," she told anyone who would listen. And people nodded, because the comfort of collective outrage feels like action, and action is easier when it's theatrical. That's when I stepped into the role of someone who refuses to be a prop. I called a neighbor meeting, not an HOA meeting, just neighbors, and I played my footage. I let the camera show a kid who made a dumb choice, and an HOA that made a worse one. The room was quiet in that way that means people are thinking about more than lawn height. My neighbor Jenna, who runs the community pantry, said, "We could help his mom, or set up workshops, teach jobs. Small options, human solutions." Lorraine's face thinned. She countered with bylaws and finds the difference between empathy and enforcement made into a contest. The climax came not with a dramatic arrest or a fist fight, but with the kind of slow, satisfying thing that lets air out of a balloon. The HOA's board meeting, packed because everyone wanted to be part of the verdict. I spoke. Jenna spoke. A former contractor named Walt, who'd had his own run-in with Lorraine over a mailbox, cleared his throat and spoke about dignity. Lorraine, who'd expected applause, got a room full of neighbors asking hard questions. "Who appointed you judge?" one man asked. "Who gave you the right?" The words were small but precise, the sort of language that splits assumptions. Lorraine tried to reclaim the narrative. She stood, clipboard like armor, and said, "I'm only trying to protect our community." But protection without accountability looks like control, and control, when it's exposed, loses its sheen. The board voted to review the HOA's policies on citizen arrests and property seizures. Lorraine was reprimanded for overreach. She would stay on the board. Power seldom evaporates entirely, but the illusion that she could act without consequence had been punctured. I won't lie. It felt good in the way it's legal to feel good when a system is reminded of its own limits. But the ending isn't tidy, and that's the point. Marco went to juvenile court, then to community service and a mentoring program. His mother accepted help from the pantry. Lorraine continued to walk her sidewalks, but with less applause. Neighbors who'd watched from the sidelines suddenly asked how they could help, and for a few weeks, the street looked less like a set for small dramas and more like a place where people did things for each other without a clipboard. So where's the moral? I don't have a poster for you. What I have is a handful of lessons bruised into place by coffee stains and timestamped footage. Power looks righteous when it's performed, and righteous looks like power. The only antidote is ordinary accountability, the kind that happens in meetings without sound bites and in conversations without microphones. It's the kind that forces us to choose between shame and help, between bylaws and human beings. If there's one thing I want you to take with you before you scroll on, before you decide who's right and who's wrong, remember this. Communities are made of choices, and choices stack up like ledgers. We can write entries that say punish or support. Both are choices. My truck was messy that morning, and I was angry, and the HOA had a clip they thought proved their savviness. But what changed things wasn't the camera, it was people deciding to treat a kid like a person and a complaint like the start of a conversation, not the end of one. Tell me what you would have done. Is neighborhood safety worth turning neighbors into prosecutors? Or is there a line we shouldn't cross?